Hey, did you know that in the mid-1800s, a Connecticut family became so terrified of a mysterious disease that they dug up their own dead relatives, believing they had become vampires? Sounds familiar? It's because in an earlier episode we talked about Mercy Brown, the young woman from Exeter, Rhode Island, whose body was exhumed in 1892 after her family became convinced that she had returned from the grave to feed on the living. At the time, it seemed like one of the strangest stories in American history. But after that episode, I kept digging. And what I discovered surprised me. Mercy Brown wasn't the only person accused of becoming a vampire. In fact, she wasn't even the first. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, families across New England were opening graves, examining bodies, and performing rituals they believed would stop the dead from harming the living. It sounded like something straight out of a horror novel. But to the people living through one of the deadliest epidemics in American history, these weren't ghost stories. They were desperate attempts to save their loved ones. Then, more than a century later, a group of children exploring the woods in Connecticut stumbled across a forgotten cemetery hidden beneath the trees. Archaeologists were called in, expecting to uncover an ordinary colonial burial ground. Instead, they found something that may represent the strongest physical evidence ever discovered of New England's vampire panic. This is the story of the Jewett City vampire and the mystery of JB55. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to another episode of Hey Did You Know, where we dig up the weird, the forgotten, and the downright strange corners of America. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe button, and that notification bell so you don't miss a future episode. We release new episodes every other Wednesday, and if you enjoy the story, be sure to leave a comment so I can hear your thoughts about the episode. But now, let's get into our story. In case you have not seen our Mercy Brown episode, let me remind you why families in New England began digging up their loved ones. Imagine living in the early 1800s. There are no antibiotics, no x-rays, no microscopes capable of revealing the bacteria that cause disease. In fact, germ theory, the idea that tiny microorganisms could make people sick, wouldn't become widely accepted until decades later. Instead, people relied on what they could see, and what they saw was terrifying. A disease known as consumption, what we now call tuberculosis, was sweeping across New England. It usually began with something that seemed harmless, a lingering cough that refused to go away. But as weeks turned into months, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Victims developed fevers, night sweats. Their skin grew pale. They lost weight at an alarming rate. And eventually, many began to cough up blood. It was slow, cruel, and some people lingered for years before finally dying, while others seemed healthy one season and were gone by the next. But what made consumption especially frightening wasn't just the disease itself. It was the way it seemed to move through families. A mother would die. Months later, a son would fall ill, then a daughter, and perhaps a husband or a cousin who were also living under the same roof. Today, we know exactly why that happened. Tuberculosis spreads through the air, and in close quarters of the 19th century homes, family members were constantly exposed to one another. But without that knowledge, people were left trying to figure out what they were witnessing with the only tools that they had: observation, tradition, and folklore. To them, it didn't look like an illness spreading from person to person. It looked as though death itself had come back for the rest of the family. That belief wasn't unique to America. Many of New England's earliest settlers had brought old European traditions with them, stories of revenants, restless spirits, and vampires that could rise from the grave and slowly drain the life out of their surviving relatives. For centuries, those stories had remained little more than folklore. But as consumption tore through town after town, those old legends suddenly didn't seem so impossible. Families began to wonder if someone who had recently died truly wasn't at rest. Maybe they were returning each night, unseen, to feed on the living. Sounds unbelievable today, but to people who had no scientific explanation for the disease destroying their communities, It offered an answer where medicine could not. Over the next 100 years, those beliefs spread throughout New England, and historians now refer to this period as the New England Vampire Panic, a time when dozens of families exhumed their loved ones in desperate hope of stopping the mysterious illness from claiming their homes. And one of the most famous examples was Mercy Brown in Rhode Island. And if you haven't seen that episode, I definitely suggest you go check it out. But years before her story captured attention, another family, living just across the border in the small village of Jewett City, Connecticut, found themselves facing the very same nightmare. By the middle of the 19th century, stories like these had become surprisingly common throughout New England. While most never made national headlines, they spread quietly from town to town, passed along by neighbors, newspapers, and local folklore. One of these stories unfolded in the small mill village of Jewett City, Connecticut. Nestled along the Quinnebog River, Jewett City was the kind of close-knit community where everyone knew one another. Like countless towns across New England, its residents depended on one another during times of hardship. And when consumption arrived, hardship was exactly what they faced. The Ray family watched as the disease slowly worked its way through their household. One family member became sick, then another, and long before it seemed as though the illness had settled over the entire family. To us, the explanation is obvious, but to the Rays and their neighbors, there was no medical explanation that made sense. Instead, they began turning to the same old folklore that had been circling throughout New England for generations. The deaths had come one after another. In 1845, 24-year-old Lemuel Ray became the first member of the family to die from the disease. His father, Henry B. Ray, followed several years later. And then, in 1851, 26-year-old Elijah Ray, Lemuel's brother, died as well. By 1854, another son, Henry Nelson Ray, had begun showing the same frightening symptoms. Over the course of roughly 9 years, consumption had claimed multiple members of the Ray family. And with another family member now racing away, and the situation growing more desperate, the Ray family and their neighbors took a drastic step. They went to the cemetery and dug up the bodies of Lemuel and Elijah. But unlike the case of Mercy Brown decades later, where her heart and liver were removed and burned, the Rays went even further. The bodies of Lemuel and Elijah were removed from their graves and burned at the cemetery, an attempt to destroy whatever supernatural force they believed was responsible for the family's suffering. But it didn't work. The illness continued claiming lives because the real enemy had never been the dead. Today, historians view the Ray family as one of the earliest well-documented examples of New England's vampire panic. And due in large part to the media attention they received at the time, the Ray family would become known as the Jewett City Vampires. Their story is remarkably similar to Mercy Brown's, separated by only a few decades and a state border. Together they paint a picture of a region gripped with fear, where ordinary families turn to extraordinary measures in search for answers. For years, stories like these survived mostly through newspaper clippings, family histories, and local legends. And some historians even wondered whether they had been exaggerated over time. Were these truly common occurrences, or had a handful of bizarre stories simply grown into regional folklore? Then, in the early 1990s, something happened that changed that conversation entirely. Near the town of Griswold, Connecticut, just a few miles from Jewett City, a group of children made a discovery that no one expected. Hidden beneath decades of brush and forest sat a forgotten cemetery, and buried inside was a skeleton that seemed to confirm those old stories in a way no legend ever could. If stories like the Ray family and Mercy Brown had been all we had, it would have been easy to dismiss them as strange pieces of New England folklore. They certainly happened, but over time many historians wondered how common these rituals really were. Were they isolated incidents, or were there countless others that had simply been forgotten? For more than a century, there was no way to know. Then, sometime in the early 1990s, an unexpected discovery in eastern Connecticut began to change that. Near a local gravel mine in the town of Griswold, a group of local children were playing along the sandy hillside when part of the embankment gave way, and 2 human skulls tumbled down the slope. Startled by what they had found, the boys alerted their parents, who quickly contacted authorities. The discovery immediately caught the attention of local authorities because at first, the investigators feared the remains might be connected to Michael Ross, the serial killer who had terrorized Connecticut during the 1980s. But it didn't take long to realize they were dealing with something far older. What initially had been treated as a possible modern crime scene quickly became an archaeological investigation when experts determined the bones belonged to a long-forgotten early 19th century burial ground known as the Walton Family Cemetery. Excavations soon began, and as researchers carefully uncovered one grave after another, one burial in particular captured their attention. A coffin decorated with small brass tacks spelling out only 3 simple markings: JB 55. No name, no inscription, just a set of initials and what appeared to be the man's age at death. But it wasn't the coffin that made the burial extraordinary. The remains inside had clearly been subjected to deliberate post-mortem ritual. Sometime after the man was buried, his grave had been reopened and his body exhumed. When he was laid back to rest the second time, his skull had been removed from the top of his spine and carefully placed across his chest, while his femurs had been arranged beneath in the shape of an X, creating a skull and crossbones pattern. To modern archaeologists, the arrangement strongly resembled anti-vampire burial practices documented elsewhere in New England. Some families removed and burned the heart and other organs, as we saw in the case of Mercy Brown. While the specific rituals varied from community to community, they all shared the same purpose: to prevent the dead from returning to harm the living. There was just one problem, though. No one knew who JB55 was. And for years, the mystery remained unsolved. Then, advances in forensic anthropology and historical research began providing answers. By studying the skeleton, researchers were able to determine that the man had lived a physically demanding life. His joints showed years of hard labor, his teeth were heavily worn, and his ribs bore signs of chronic lung disease. But perhaps the most important clue wasn't found in his bones at all. It was found on his coffin. Specifically the lid. Remember those brass tacks arranged to form the initials JB? They were used along with cemetery records, historical documents, and later DNA analysis to eventually identify the man as John Barber, a local farmer who died in the early 19th century. Historical records revealed something else that caught their attention. John Barber had almost certainly died from consumption. More than 200 years after his death, John Barber may represent the strongest physical evidence ever discovered in the New England vampire panic. Not because he proves vampires existed, but because he proves that the people who buried him may have truly believed that they did. Today, it's easy to look back at stories like these and dismiss them as little more than strange folklore. After all, we know what consumption really was. We understand that tuberculosis is caused by bacteria, how it spreads, and why entire families often became infected while living under the same roof. But for people in the 19th and 18th century in New England, none of that knowledge existed. All they saw was a terrifying pattern. Someone would die, only for another family member to begin coughing weeks or months later. Before long, an entire household could be gone. Without an understanding of germs or disease, they searched for answers the only way they knew how. Some turned to faith, others trusted whatever remedies local doctors could offer, and many looked at old stories their families had carried across the Atlantic. Stories of restless dead who refused to stay in their graves. Those beliefs would give rise to what we of course know was the New England vampire panic. And during that century-long period of families exhuming their loved ones, historians have documented at least 80 of these exhumations across New England. And it's entirely possible there were many more that were never recorded. And what makes the story of JB55 so remarkable, unlike Mercy Brown or the Ray family, whose stories survived through newspapers and local accounts, John Barber left something far more rare: evidence. His grave wasn't just another legend passed down through generations, it became an archaeological record of what fear could drive ordinary people to do. Long after the name of those who buried him had been forgotten, the arrangement of his bones preserved a story that historians are still piecing together more than 2 centuries later. To me, that's one of the most fascinating things about history. It's easy to judge the past by what we know today, But history asks us to imagine what it was like to live without the answers we now take for granted. If your family was dying one by one, every doctor had a different explanation, every remedy failed, and your neighbors all believed the dead might be somehow responsible, would you have believed them? I'd like to think that I wouldn't. But if these stories teach us anything, it's that fear has always shaped the way people understand the unknown. The people in New England weren't chasing monsters, they were chasing hope. They were trying to save the people they loved with the only explanations that they had. So, my question for you, if you had lived in New England during the height of the vampire panic, with no knowledge of bacteria or tuberculosis, do you think you would have believed the dead were somehow responsible? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know what you think. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to share it with a friend. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so you never miss an episode of Hey Did You Know? Because next time, we'll be here to uncover yet another forgotten story from America's past. Until next time, thank you for listening.